How did a tank built to fight German Tigers and Panthers in World War II end up witnessing some of the darkest conflicts of the modern era? Now you'll see what the Centurions did in their 5-decade war journey. Let's begin. The story of the Centurion actually begins in World War II. It was supposed to be Britain's finally correct response to German heavy tanks that had been decimating Allied armor since the moment they appeared on the battlefield. The British had the 17-pounder gun, the only weapon they possessed that could destroy those tanks effectively at anything beyond a point-blank side shot. So they wanted to mount this gun into a new great tank. However, that proved easier said than done. When the Challenger project failed and D-Day approached, there was still no such tank anywhere near combat ready, so they began converting Sherman tanks into Sherman Fireflies, cramming the 17-pounder into a regular Sherman turret with plenty of modifications. This gave the still vulnerable Sherman a fighting chance to destroy Tigers and Panthers head-on at combat ranges. But the Firefly was just an improvised stopgap until a real solution could arrive. That solution was the heavy cruiser A-41, better known as Centurion. However, because Britain was actively fighting a war, the main focus went into producing existing tank models. As a result, the development of the Centurion was slow. By the time the first couple of prototypes were ready to be tested in combat, Germany was collapsing and forces were surrendering en masse. Still, the British really wanted to see how it would perform in combat, so 6 Centurions were quickly dispatched to Antwerp in May 1945. From there, they drove 400 miles across Belgium and the Netherlands, but sadly for High Command, and probably luckily for Centurion crews, Germany decided to ruin their debut by inconsiderately surrendering on May 8, 1945. However, this late arrival wouldn't mean the end of the Centurion, quite the opposite. The dark truth is that we humans will never run out of wars. Centurions were put to different tests, tried their guns on knocked-out German armor, and were compared to other Allied tanks. Mobility, firepower, and crew comfort proved better than any older design, and the tests would be enough to put the Centurion into full production. Soon, it would begin its journey to becoming one of the most widely used and upgraded tanks of the upcoming Cold War era. The first production variant, the Centurion Mark I, entered service in 1946. It had the 20mm gun coaxial to the 17-pounder, but it was quickly found out it took up too much space inside the turret, with large ammunition drums complicating crews' lives more than necessary, and it was phased out in later models. Some versions would have both the 50 and 30 caliber coaxial machine guns, even used for estimating the range for the main gun. Newer versions, or as the British would say marks, were quickly coming in, correcting and improving on the previous. It would eventually have 13 main production upgrades, with literally hundreds of various other modifications. In 1948, Mark III became a major step forward, now armed with the 20-pounder, which is 84 instead of 77mm caliber, and with stabilization for firing on the move. It could fire more modern armor-piercing discarding sabot rounds with even greater armor penetration. Also, did you know that Centurion holds the biggest gun ever mounted on a tank title? In an experimental version, an enormous 183mm gun was mounted in a fully enclosed turret as an attempt to counter the Soviet IS-3 if it came to open war. But it was quickly cancelled. I think I don't need to explain why. Centurion started to be exported to friendly nations, but it still never saw actual combat. Then came 1950, and the Korean War broke out. Initially, mostly Churchills and Cromwells were sent to support the United Nations forces, but as the conflict intensified, it was time for the Centurion to step in. 18 Centurion Mark IIIs were sent to the mountainous terrain of Korea, and they would see several intense engagements. Centurion's first confirmed tank kill was actually a captured British Cromwell tank used by North Korean forces. When the Chinese launched a heavy offensive with over 27,000 troops, Centurions were rushed to the front line to help the infantry. They provided direct fire support and helped UN forces retreat while trying to break through and relieve surrounded units. 5 Centurions were knocked out, but it proved it could definitely do the job. It also showed a pintle-mounted machine gun on the turret is a must-have to protect the tank from swarming infantry. This was its first fight, and from there it's going just to be progressively more intense. After British intelligence examined the Soviet T-54 captured during the Hungarian uprising and saw its thick and sloped frontal armor with the powerful 100mm gun, they upgraded new Mark VII Centurions with the 105mm L7 gun, which became standard for Western tank guns. Using lessons from World War II and desert tank battles, the gun was made to be able to depress 10 degrees downward, which is extremely important for uneven terrain or fighting from a hull-down position, and you'll hear more about that in a moment. Only 4 rounds for the main gun were in the ready rack inside the turret, with 6 more under the gun. The rest were loaded in the hull under the floor, as again, lessons showed that storing ammo high in the turret wouldn't be beneficial when the tank gets hit and starts burning. It also had many other features like fast reverse gear and wide hatches. In the next big engagement, Centurion would earn its dark reputation. Here, it would actually fight tanks that were supposed to be its friends and allies, the American Patterns. In the Indo-Pakistani War, Indian Centurions would fight American-supplied M47 and M48 patterns of the Pakistani army, and in what was actually one of the biggest tank battles after World War II, Pakistan launched a major offensive in Operation Grand Slam, deploying over 350 tanks. Indian most modern Centurion Mark 7s dug in and allowed the Pakistanis to advance into a deliberately flooded field. When most of them bogged down, Centurions opened fire, decimating Pakistani armor. Around 100 tanks were either destroyed or captured for the price of just 6 Centurions. The battlefield became known as Patton City, and not in an honorable way. So here the Centurion proved itself in tank-on-tank combat, but the next war would be something entirely different from what the Centurion was actually designed for, the Vietnam War. You maybe didn't think the Centurion even fought in Vietnam, but it did, and it had quite a few heavy engagements in the hands of the Australian army. Australians used their own modified version of the Centurion, with added machine guns and many other smaller modifications. In Vietnam, Centurions were usually providing direct infantry support and defended bases, but they would have a few quite dark and dramatic stories to tell. During an offensive operation, Australian infantry became pinned down by heavy fire when they stumbled upon a heavily defended North Vietnamese stronghold. Centurions were about 1 kilometer behind them when they received a frantic call for help. With no other way, they sprinted forward and bashed through the jungle directly towards the pinned-down infantry. But Centurion tank commanders soon found out that in the thick jungle between them and the infantry in trouble, there were small patches of cleared vegetation. Then they saw bunkers. Turns out they had stumbled upon a huge enemy position used as a training base. Centurions started engaging the enemy at point-blank range, firing into the bunkers. There were so many of them that they used all high-explosive and even armor-piercing shells, then tried to drive over the bunkers and rotate the tracks to collapse them. However, these bunkers were built to withstand bombing strikes, so most of them wouldn't collapse. The fighting was so close that North Vietnamese RPGs wouldn't detonate upon hitting Centurions because of the minimum firing distance safety feature. At such close range, the rocket wouldn't arm, so it wouldn't kill the RPG operator. A couple of Centurions received what would have been kill shots from RPGs in the back of their tanks, which luckily didn't detonate. North Vietnamese then fired RPGs into the trees to try to take out the crew with shrapnel. The battle lasted more than 8 hours, ending when US Cobra gunships arrived to help with heavy fire support. One of the Centurions, before being deployed in Vietnam, was actually used in an atomic experiment in Australia. It was parked 500 yards from the detonation point of a nuclear device, with standard combat fuel, ammo load and mannequins instead of crew. It was expected to be completely destroyed to observe the effects of nuclear weapons on tanks. However, when they came to examine the Centurion after the explosion, they were shocked. The fireball tore through the desert with temperatures reaching 1,000 degrees Celsius and shockwaves flattening everything in a wide radius. But the Centurion was still there, just slightly displaced by the shockwave. Its paint was scorched off and rubber parts melted, but the tank actually still worked. The engine started after minor repairs, and the turret still traversed, with no breaches in armor and no internal fires. This experiment gave it quite a boost in its reputation. In Israeli hands, the British Centurion became the Shot, Hebrew for whip. At first, Israeli crews were not impressed because Centurions were unreliable during training, but General Israel Tal saw potential. He overhauled the training system, enforced strict maintenance standards, and pushed crews to master the tank. The results were staggering. Well-trained Israeli crews could now fire up to 15 rounds per minute. They also upgraded Centurions with American diesel engines and automatic transmissions. The Shot made its combat debut in the Six-Day War of 1967, but it was during the Yom Kippur War in 1973 when Centurions literally did the impossible. On the Golan Heights, just 177 Israeli Centurions held off 1,400 Syrian tanks. During the first 3 days, every Israeli tank was hit 1.5 times on average. It should have been a slaughter for the Centurions. However, something completely unexpected happened. Damaged tanks were repaired on the spot, recrewed with surviving, often already wounded crews, and sent right back into the fight. By the end of the battle, crews of these modified Centurions had destroyed over 500 Syrian T-55s and T-62s. While many nations slowly began to retire or replace their Centurions with newer main battle tanks, South Africa did something different. They took Centurions and transformed them beyond recognition, with some of the heaviest upgrades this World War II tank would ever receive. Their Oliphant, meaning elephant versions, would get new diesel engines with up to 1,040 horsepower, along with many other improvements from transmission to optics and fire control systems. Passive composite armor was mounted around the tank, and it was a tough opponent against Soviet-supplied tanks they were fighting against in their dark and turbulent years. So, despite being designed and produced during World War II, the Centurion is actually still in use today by some countries, although heavily modified from the original.